Stories are more than just words on a page. They carry layers of meaning, weaving together the spiritual, the historical, and the human experience. They remind us of who we are and invite us to consider who we're becoming. This week we dive into one of the most striking and mysterious stories in the scripture, the story of Noah and the flood. It's a tale of destruction and renewal, judgment and mercy, chaos and restoration. But beyond the surface, this story calls us to wrestle with deep truths about sin, redemption, and what it means to walk with God in the midst of a broken world. The flood isn't just an event, it's a profound metaphor for transformation, reminding us that through death comes life, and through surrender, we find rest. Let's pull on this thread together and uncover the deeper truths that flow through this ancient and powerful story. Last week, we talked about the story of Cain and Abel, and we really focused in on authorial intent, meaning that instead of trying to dissect the story in a materialistic or scientific framework, we asked what was trying to be communicated by the authors when this was written down. And this is important to keep in mind as we travel through the rest of these ancient stories in our series called Biblical History. And the obvious emphasis on the word here is story. Because these are oral stories that were spiritually preserved through the life and culture of early believers in God, and then eventually written down. And Noah and the flood, it preserves this tradition. It continues on with it. And I remind us of these things because it's easy to be baited into frivolous arguments, especially when it comes to the story of the flood. We commit the same fallacy as the vitriolic skeptic when we make the focus of the whole story around whether the flood was a global or a local flood, or whether they could fit every single species on the earth into the confines of the ark, or how a family of 8 could fit a year's worth of food and water into the ark for thousands, if not millions of animals, and then disperse it to them every single day for over a year. You think of these types of things, and they're nothing more than temptations to argue about things that the story was never intended to have as the focal point. Now, what's trying to be passed down here are not facts for us to memorize, but something that is enduring, something impacting and spiritually transformative. It's the stories are multi-dimensional in nature, and you could say that the story of the flood is truer than true. When we come at it solely trying to justify the literal interpretation, it's often just a response that grows out of our inability to see it within the dynamic light of these ancient peoples who had these beautiful stories as cornerstones to a life that was rich with meaning and just full of color. So let's not try to relegate this story to a series of black and white frames and then just check it off of a Bible reading plan. Let's become immersed in the story because that's the intention. That's what it's calling for us to do. Okay, so one of the first things that we begin to notice about the story of Noah and the flood is that it is much longer and more detailed than the previous stories. It's almost twice the length of the first, 3 chapters. It's of creation, the fall, Cain and Abel combined, right? It spans through 5 different chapters. And I mean, there were some pretty big events that happened prior to the flood, and there was seemingly a lot of history that happened from creation all the way to the flood. But we only have a couple of chapters of that. And you may have heard this term before, but the age from the beginning of creation to the flood is called the Antediluvian period, or it comes from the Latin ante, meaning before, and diluvium, meaning flood, right? So before the flood. And we get real creative when we describe the age after the flood. We call it the post-diluvian period, right? Latin post meaning after, and diluvium meaning flood, so after the flood. So the time before the flood, the Antediluvian period, there are about 5 chapters, but that's a whole period of civilization, right? This is in stark contrast to, say, like David's biblical records, who's only one man, but he has about 135 chapters dedicated to him, right? That's a massive difference. Why do we have more chapters dedicated to David's adultery than we do the creation of the whole earth itself? But it's similar to why you probably have more memories from that like one awkward middle school dance than you do from like the first 2 whole years of your life. Humanity's early years of consciousness They were important, but believe it or not, humanity couldn't even write until about 5,000 years ago, and even after that, for hundreds of years, the writing was pictographs and abstract symbols used by ancient governments whose main purpose was to count and organize these various elements needed in larger societies during the agricultural booms in human history. They weren't even writing like poetry or stories. They were counting bundles of barley. Very simple things, not nuanced or complex by any stretch of the imagination, at least compared to how we use written language today. And you'll hear me say this as we travel through these early stories over and over again. But I say it because we will misinterpret so many things if we don't always keep this in our minds. Like a child in its early years, these early stories, they don't have all the nuances and concrete details that come later. And trust me, they will come. Just read the book of Leviticus. And even now, as we get ready to go into the study of Noah, we see that there are now more words, more descriptions being used. The chapters are longer. It's more detailed. The happenings, they're more concrete than what we've encountered in the chapters prior. But it's still very much mytho-history. And don't run away when I say the word mytho-history, because it's not a fairy tale. It's not fake history. It's how people who were less linguistically focused than us today communicated what they believed to be was the most important thing about the past. And there are elements that people might scoff at today, but the reason that they're so grand and colorful and immersive is because that's how these stories were retained through oral tradition. So we're witnessing this very transition in consciousness and literature right before our very eyes. The human brain, right, it can retain these stories really well, and stories in general, but it doesn't really, it's not really built to retain all these specific mathematical concrete numbers and details. And that's why written language was invented, actually. And we're watching this leak into the stories right before our very eyes. It's really amazing. All right, so I just loaded us with a bunch of information, but hopefully it will prevent me from having to stop in the middle of the story and do that. I kind of just wanted to get it out of the way. So we go to the first mention of Noah that we have in the Bible, and that is in Genesis chapter 5. And it starts out in verse 28, and it says, "When Lamech had lived 128 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, saying, 'This one will bring us comfort from our labor and from the painful toil of our hands, because of the ground that the Lord has cursed.'" We're going to pause there, right? There are several word plays on the name Noah in the story of the flood, but this one is very explicit, right? Lamech says that he was named Noah because he's going to bring us comfort, or an alternative understanding, rest from the curse. And we lose this in translation, but the name Noah appears to be related to the Hebrew word nuach, or to rest. Right? Native Hebrew speakers can identify that this idea of saying, of saving God's people or bringing rest to God's people, it's built into his very name. And Lamech explains this, but it's kind of harder for us to see that because we speak English. We don't see the play on words with the Noah and Noach. And this is important because he's one of the first characters introduced in all of Scripture that is a type of Christ. And when I say a type of Christ, I mean one that is anointed to bring rest to God's people or to save God's people. So it seems to be that Noah was born into a very difficult or tumultuous times, right? There are a couple of things that are going on. First is what we just read. The people are dealing with the ground being cursed. And what is this curse? Well, it's calling us back to Genesis 3, when man was cursed to work the ground, right? In Genesis 3:17. "But to Adam, he said, 'Because you obeyed your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground thanks to you. In painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, but you will eat the grain of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat the food until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return." Now, this curse is more of a curse of relegation, not necessarily that the ground itself was cursed to the extent that we're going to see later, but that man could not freely eat of the abundance of what was grown on his behalf. Now he had to work if he wanted to eat. Okay, so there's that curse, but also there's the curse of Cain in Genesis 4. Now Cain, he was a farmer, right? That was his job. He worked the ground. But we're given the imagery of him murdering his brother. And how is it that God knows that he murdered his brother? Well, God says, right? I hear he says, what have you done, right? But the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. So now you are banished from the ground, which the Lord has opened its mouth to receive, your brother's blood from your hand. When you try to cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its best for you. You will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. All right. We note a couple of things here that are good for us when we're trying to understand this, right? God says, I hear the voice of your brother's blood crying out from the ground, okay? From the ground. And then in the next section, God joins these principles together and says, so now you are banished from the ground, which was opened its mouth up to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And now when you try to cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its best for you. Okay, so we're meant to see this connection between violence or blood spilling on the ground and the ground being poisoned or cursed because of that. And this is important because in Genesis 6:11, right, what does it say? It says, the earth was ruined, or the ground was ruined, in the sight of God. The earth was filled with violence. God saw the earth, and indeed it was ruined, for all living creatures on the earth were sinful. So God said to Noah, I have decided that all living creatures must die, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am about to destroy them and the earth. Okay, so the earth is ruined. We're getting that picture, and it's ruined because of the violence that's happening. Connecting us back to Lamech's observation, the earth was ruined, that the ground was cursed, meaning only by painful toil and labor did it produce some measly crops, which is Cain's curse, because that was brought about by bloodshed, or the blood, you could say, poisoning the ground. So to them, to the readers, to the people in this day, to the people listening to the story, the issue is one and the same, right? Violence and poor crop production. Blood poisons the soil and therefore the whole environment, which is why God wants to wipe everything out. Everything has been poisoned, right? That's the image and connection that abstract thinkers, that the people that are listening to the story, those that are hearing it, it's being passed down to, this is what the connection that they make. And this is a very obvious thing to them, but it's not to us, which is why I had to explain the whole thing. Now, another thing to ask is, where are these people living? Right? Noah's obviously not alone. He's standing out in sharp contrast to his contemporaries. So he's most likely living in or around the Fertile Crescent and in these growing metropolitans or something like that. And there are obviously more people on Earth than just Noah and his family. These societies are likely in the early stages of urbanization following the agricultural revolution. And even though we're not given exactly where Noah lives geographically, we know that societies in the Near East during this time are developing around waterways or developing around rivers. And what's being described to us here indicates that Noah is living kind of in the cradle of civilization, meaning probably along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, civilizations boomed in the Fertile Crescent because, well, the ground was fertile. It's the Fertile Crescent. This means that crop production could be systematic and done on a large scale, which is how massive societal infrastructures could be maintained with some level of stability. And that's how these big cities are popping up, these initial first big cities that we have ruins of. But why is the ground fertile in these areas? That's a good question to ask, because you need more than just water to grow crops. You need fertile soil. These civilizations weren't just popping up around fresh water. They were growing around fresh water and fertile soil. All right. This is where we begin to connect all of these ideas, right? How was it that there was both a constant supply of fresh water and fertile soil in the cradle of civilization, or the Fertile Crescent? It was due to the seasonal flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates that brought in silt deposits and fresh water to the ground every single year. That's how we would explain it, right? But how did they see it, right? They saw flooding as something that was very real, very important thing that brought cleansing to the ground and a renewal to all living things. It helped their crops grow, but at the same time, it was uncontrollable, right? They didn't know when floods were going to happen, uncontrollable, unknowable, and therefore classified very much as a spiritual thing, just like the wind. We've talked about that before. So there was a very spiritual element, uncontrollable element to rivers and to flooding for everyone. All right. So then what happened when the rivers didn't flood like they were supposed to? That's a good question, because this is kind of where we see Noah. For the people, it wasn't just about having a bad harvest or the ground being ruined. It meant something deeper was going on, because no matter how much they worked the land, the ground wouldn't produce without flooding. Here's the idea the story's trying to communicate, right? Violence and sin are poisoning the soil itself, but they're not dual thinkers, right? They're non-dual. So the poisoning existed simultaneously as both a moral and environmental curse, right? Think about the story of Cain. His brother's blood cries out from the ground, and that blood brings a curse on the ground. There's a spiritual problem that's not disconnected from the physical problem. They're both intertwined, and there's the same principle here. Their sin, their violence, it's weighing on the land, so to speak. So without the floodwaters to wash it clean and bring renewal, the soil stays cursed. It stays dry, unfruitful, lifeless. For them, the failure of the flood was a powerful reminder that life and abundance weren't just physical realities. They were deeply spiritual, entirely dependent on God's provision and his ability to bring renewal. And I won't go on this theme too much because it'll ruin the lesson on the Tower of Babel, but these growing cultures, they were rife with immorality. They were rife with violence and sin, not unlike these larger metropolitans that we have today. What they embodied that was so egregious to God was self-sufficiency or collective self-consciousness. The way that these people are living, whether it's in the time of Noah or with the Tower of Babel or with Sodom and Gomorrah or Babylon, is supposed to stand out in stark contrast to the way that God intended for people to live in the garden. These societies, you could say, they embrace the curse instead of fighting it. In a symbolic way, you say that they didn't just eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They decided collectively to make it their primary form of sustenance. They leaned into the immediate gratifications of gluttony, sensuality, selfishness, sin, right? This is how you might categorize what lies at the core of modern city living. But just like in the garden, the ultimate consequences are not immediate. There's always some type of momentary or temporal success, but it always ends in destruction, right? It's not a sustainable or a healthy way to live. It's unnatural. It doesn't align with the way that we were always designed, intended to be. Now, this is what we're seeing taking place with the people in Noah's time. It's reaching a breaking point, but Noah is not like them. He's described in Genesis chapter 6, just a couple of verses before this last one, as a godly man. He was blameless among his contemporaries. He walked with God, and then he had 3 sons, right? This is important because this idea that he walked with God is a phrase that's meant to portray this Edenic state of intimacy. Even though he's in the world, he's not of the world, right? We're using a New Testament passage to explain it. He may live in the city, but his heart is in the garden. He still has an ear to hear. He still has eyes to see. He walks with God. He's God conscious. He's full of the Spirit, or he's full of God's life still. And it's through this connection that he has a pulse on how things are going to go down, right? So when he hears God call, he heeds God's warning, and that's important, right? What warning are we talking about? Well, God tells Noah he's going to send a flood. Well, that's great. That's exactly what the people have been waiting for. We need a good flood. No. You don't understand. The flood doesn't just bring life and fertility. It washes away corruption and poison. It's a twofold event, and you can't have one without the other. So as long as there was violence, brother killing brother, soaking the very ground from which man was formed with the blood of the Imago Dei, or the image of God, there could be no alleviation from the curse. There could be no rest. And the only way to cleanse the stains of blood from the face of the earth is through the destruction of a flood, through death. And this is the meaning of the flood. The people in the time of Noah desperately wanted silt deposits, nutrients, and life that the flood brought, right? They wanted rest. They wanted comfort. They wanted an easier harvest. But they resisted the flood because it meant that it would wash away the sin that they so loved and cherished. They didn't want to wash away the blood that was soaking the ground beneath their feet. But they did learn a lesson, right? The waters, they're coming, no matter what. And the flood's not just meaningless chaos, death, and destruction. It destroys only what was never meant to be there in the first place. It wipes away everything we have built, every image and edifice constructed out of our grandiose self-obsession and absorption. It reminds us of the futility of our worldly pleasures and pursuits. It shows you how empty the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil leaves us. And all of it can be washed away in just mere moments. The story reminds us that the floodwaters, they're coming for everyone and everything. But you get to choose. Will you drown clinging onto the idols of your self-consciousness, weighed down by the investments you've made in perishable things? Or will you let go? Will you untie yourself from every weight and sin that so easily besets us? Will you kill your ego before it rips you under the current? Because only by entering through death can we find rest for our weary souls, souls that are heavy laden, souls that are tired of being weighed down by our self-consciousness, yearning to be relieved, to take on the yoke of Jesus, the yoke of God consciousness, to be filled with the Spirit. But in order for the wind of the Spirit to blow over the chaotic waters and bring new life, like it did in creation in Genesis 1, like it did with Noah in Genesis 8, like it did with Moses and the Red Sea in Exodus 14, like it did with the apostles in the upper room in Acts 2, something has to go down into the watery grave. The wind will not blow, the Spirit will not move, life will not flourish, and God will not breathe until there is a cleansing. And you can be made new, yes, but that means the old you has to die. You must embrace the flood, or to quote the Apostle Peter, in the ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were delivered through water. And this symbolized baptism, which now saves you. Not the washing of physical dirt, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Listen, baptism is not as cheap as getting wet and appeasing your conscience. You know how baptism saves you? It destroys you. It is a symbol of self-annihilation. It's meant to indicate to God, to you, and to everyone around you that every idolatrous construct you crafted for the express purpose of conceit and self-worship has been utterly desecrated and cleansed from God's temple, so that you can rise up and say, it is no longer I who lives, but Christ lives in me. And we go with him into death and take on his yoke so that we can find rest, because in the story, after all the chaos, the destruction, the flooding, and the death, all that's left over is renewed creation. And what does God do after he creates? Well, he rests. And who is left after the flood when creation is renewed? Noah. Nuach, which is Hebrew for rest. And we find that to God, life and death perpetually circulate within his essence, that there's a very thin line that differentiates destruction and creation. For whoever tries to keep his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will preserve it. Indeed, the only way to truly live is to die. And there are so many things that we can take from this story of Noah, but none so potent as this. Embrace the flood. Don't cling to things in this life that can be so easily washed away. Just give up and let go. If you will let the little God inside of you, the image that you have carefully crafted of yourself, that you want others to see, your self-concept, that little voice inside your head that you're always talking to in here, if you will only let it die, God will create in you what was always intended to be. What will be born is an identity that is indistinguishable from our Creator, a perfect union and a oneness with the consciousness of God and therefore God himself. It's the restoration of sonship, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The story of Noah and the flood is the story of the gospel. By embracing the flood and its destruction, we embrace the cross and its death. But it is the narrow way that leads to life, and few there will be that go by it. Just ask Noah.